upland hunting for many years, and that was okay, but it's different with a pointing dog.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I bet. All right, so you should have the thing showing up, and it looks like we are going live. And I'm muting the site. So, and actually I can trim this video a little bit after, so we'll do a share screen. All right.
You're muted, Rob.
That's just how it goes, right? Exactly. My mouse stops working on my computer just as I start the show. But anyway, welcome to Waters Up. This is a one-of-a-kind water industry podcast where listeners can actually earn free PDHs just for listening. And I'll talk about that, how you redeem those credits in just a minute. First, I want to mention that this is our 7th episode. So make sure you go on and check us out on YouTube, youtube.com/Waters Up, and check out some of our past episodes. And then, I need to thank our sponsor for this episode. Without sponsors, we don't have the shows, and we're not allowed, and I wouldn't be able to provide free credit hours if it wasn't for the help of our generous sponsors. So I'd like to take a minute and thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Pierce Atwood. Pierce Atwood LLP is a highly regarded full-service law firm with offices in Portland and Augusta, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Providence, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. And Pierce Atwood provides legal and business counsel to its clients, which range from regional and local enterprises, utilities, financiers, middle market companies, and entrepreneurs to Fortune 500 companies, multinational corporations, and state and foreign governments. Their lawyers provide clients with a full suite of services covering energy and environmental, employment, real estate, corporate, and intellectual property issues. So again, I need to thank them. And I've used them for many years and had a great relationship with them. And when I asked if they would be willing to sponsor this episode, they were more than willing to step up and provide backing for this. So. And then how to receive credit. So after the show, for anyone that's listening in, we will post a link in the comment section on the YouTube site, or you can also access this through the Maine Water Utilities website, mwua.org. Click on Waters Up, and in the comments section, you will see a link to a quiz. It will take you to a very short quiz, probably 3 or 4 questions that basically only a listener to this show would be able to answer. It's not technical related. It just proves that you were listening. And once you fill out that quiz and hit submit, our wonderful staff at Maine Water Utilities will process that and send you your credit hours. So pretty easy to do after the show. And with that, we'll get started. So as I was saying earlier, this is episode 7, and it's Waters Up with the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. Many people in the industry know that it was 50 years ago this year. We're still in 2022. It was 50 years ago this year that the U.S. Senate passed the Clean Water Act, and much of that effort was led by Senator Ed Muskie. And earlier this fall, a bunch of us met in the Riverbank, Payson Park, is it? Or what's the park called, Mac? I can't remember.
In Lewiston? Payson Park?
Yeah, Payson Park in Lewiston, right on the riverbank, and we celebrated 50 years of water improvement and cleaning up of the Androscoggin River. And of course, it wasn't just the Androscoggin River; all Maine rivers were impacted by the Clean Water Act. So with me today, I have three guests, all with great background and an awesome interest in our water bodies in the state of Maine. And I've spent the last couple of days chatting with them, and they're all very interesting, fun people. So hopefully, who knows where this conversation is going to take us, but we have a rough outline and some things to guide us. But I'll start it off with Alan Haley. And he was the first whitewater guide on the Kennebec River. So thanks, Alan, for joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. So tell me a little bit about yourself. I know that you've been a teacher, you've done some guiding. How, if you just met someone on the street, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I guess I'd say that my relationship to clean water, and like I have one like everybody does, but I went to work on it in 1976. I was a young kid just getting done graduate school, and I always wanted to be a Maine guide. I grew up in Dexter, and I got an opportunity by a weird association I have with a man who was a guide in Rockwood, Maine, Wayne Hockmeyer, who was going to invest in a big whitewater rafting adventure. At the time, we didn't know it was going to be big. We thought it would end up being one boat, but he was a fishing guide, and he hired me to guide his whitewater boats. I'd done a lot of canoeing and running canoe trips in the years previous to that. So I ended up not only starting the business, but of course the whitewater business almost coincidentally began at the same year that was the last year of the great logging drives. And so with the change of one industry that was receding, the woods industry, whitewater rafting started its growth, 1976.
Okay, wow. So was that first boat, was that the Silver Bullet? Or I have something in my notes here that referenced the Silver Bullet. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, we had early on, like any industry, we didn't know anything about what we were doing. The man that had put the money up front was one of the best businessmen I ever knew in my life, actually. But no one at the time knew anything about whitewater rafting or what it entailed or what you would buy. And although he was an exceptionally sharp man, he allowed himself to get kind of snookered by a guy that was working on the New River in West Virginia. And he bought from him a raft he had that he said would last us. Well, that was true. It did last us for years and years and years, but it was the heaviest, most miserable, leak-ridden boat you ever saw. It had no rocker to it, so it laid flat on the water. It was almost this amorphous lump, very hard to move around, and it leaked incessantly. And so he heard that there was this paint you could paint on the raft and stop the leaks. So we bought the paint. It turned out to be silver. The paint stuck like hell to that raft and that neoprene, but it didn't really stop the leaks very much. But that raft was so tough and was made so solidly that it lasted for years and became almost a legend on the Kennebec River. People still talk about the Silver Bullet today. It's this giant thing that we always let the new guides use because it was such a dog to try and handle. And that's where the legend of that boat came from. We used it for a good many years. We started in 1976, and even then it was 10 years old. The British Leyland had been built in the early 60s. But we kept that raft. As a matter of fact, the last day I worked, I guided that boat. And years later, they took it up to the Rockwood dump and cut it in half with a chainsaw and left it there.
So you got any idea what was in that silver paint?
I have no idea whatsoever. Although it stuck very well, as I say, it never really stopped the leaks. That boat boat leaked so bad that we had to carry a pump with us. And at dinner time, we'd have to pump the thing back up. It would really freak out the customer when it got down real low, But it was it was hard to manage, hard to move around. I mean, rafts on their very best are hard to guide and hard to really maneuver well. But that thing got jammed into gorge walls and crushed and loaded down. It would load down with water to the point where you'd only have 4 or 5 inches of freeboard. And our big problem, you couldn't flip that raft over, but you frequently would wash people out of it. You sat so low in the water. I mean, you'd have 1,000 gallons of water in that boat by the time you made it halfway down the river. It was really quite a thing. Everybody hated it. In the end, that's all anybody could talk about 20 years later.
Yeah, well, I'd love to try it. I've been on some of the newer rafts today. And this sounds like this
Yeah.
would be quite a different ride. So,
Well,
but
they're
obviously
self-sailing
people loved it.
today. Today, if you go on a raft, they have a fabric floor that you're on and allows water to come in, and the floor is inflatable. So you don't even have to bail the boat out. Those boats back then, had, right up until I'm going to say 1987 or 8, all the boats in the Kennebec River were you had to bail. You had to carry buckets with you in order to bail them out of water.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Alan, and thanks for joining us today. And I think we're going to hear a few more good stories from you as the show progresses. But we'll move on to our second guest is Nick Bennett, who is a staff scientist and Healthy Waters project director for the Natural Resources Council of Maine, NRCM for short. And I may refer to that a few times as we go through the show. And he's a Yale University graduate, an avid duck hunter. He's won tons of awards and likes dogs and coffee ice cream. So, but Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your passion for the water industry?
So I've been a staff scientist at the Natural Resources Council of Maine since 1997. And I would say my interest in clean water started at a very young age. I grew up in two places. One of them was in Riverdale, which is the very northwest part of the Bronx. So I was right next to the Hudson River and used to walk in a park near the Hudson all the time. And this must have been right around the time the Clean Water Act was drafted, maybe a little bit after. But I remember having a fifth grade assignment to write an essay that I wrote about the river. And featured prominently in that was how bad it smelled. And I remember that my teacher read the essay aloud to my class. So I think that was, an inkling of sort of where I was going to be headed. I also was very lucky growing up because my father worked at the Marine Biological Laboratories in Woods Hole, Massachusetts in the summertime when the animals that he did experiments with were available. And so I got to go there in the summers, and I had a 13-foot whaler. And I spent all of the time that I had free out in that whaler, catching bluefish, catching stripers, catching bonita. And, when I was 17, the first warnings about PCBs and bluefish came out. And they were saying, you should only have a couple meals a month. And I laughed because I was eating bluefish 3 times a day. I would have smoked bluefish for breakfast, leftover bluefish from the night before for a sandwich at lunch, and then fresh bluefish for dinner. Because if I finished up my summer job, I'd just hop in the whaler, go out and catch a bluefish and have it for dinner. The fishing was that good. And I did that for years and years. And so anyway, I think I just was very drawn to the beauty of Maine and the opportunity that working here would bring me. And I think I was sort of, born into a love for fishing and the water and boats. And, a big new passion for me when I came to Maine was duck hunting. And I moved from duck hunting into upland hunting. And, but anyway, that's a whole separate conversation. But that's sort of how I got into this, and I feel very grateful for the opportunity to work to help make Maine rivers better for all of us. And that's what I've been doing since 1997.
Well, I appreciate your efforts for sure, and I'd say you definitely came to the right place. And Maine certainly is a beautiful state, and I do a lot of fishing and hunting myself, and so I can relate. And if I could somehow pass off a podcast for credits and doing a whole episode about hunting, I would do that, and then I'd ask you to come back and we could just share stories. So. But we gotta stick to the topics at hand. So thank you, Nick, for joining us today. And I also have with us Clayton Mac Richardson, who I've known of the people on the show today. I've known Mac the longest. He's a colleague of mine who was a former superintendent at the Lewiston Auburn Water Pollution Control Facility, or I can't remember what LOPCA is the short. He's also a founding member of NEBRA, and as far as I'm concerned, he's an expert in biosolids and wastewater treatment, and he's also an avid outdoorsman. So Mac, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you were drawn to the water industry.
Well, as I look back on life, I've always loved water. I love to kayak and canoe. I've done the Allagash Wilderness Waterway a couple times. I've whitewater rafted on the Deschutes and the Rogue River in Oregon, and the Dead and the Kennebec here in Maine. And last spring, my kids and I went down the Colorado River, down through the Grand Canyon, 18-day whitewater rafting trip, which was very interesting. But water's always been something I just love. But as far as getting into the business, I sort of followed my mom in. She was a early civil environmental back when she graduated college in 1949 from Oregon State. They called it sanitary engineering, but anyway, so I sort of followed the business, followed her.
All right. So, hey, you mentioned the Colorado River. So there was a famous movie, I don't know, 20 years ago with Kevin Bacon. I think they were rafting down the Colorado River. But has that river changed? Did they talk to you about that over the last 20 years with drought and so forth? Or is it relatively the same because it's dam controlled?
Well, the Colorado River, the big thing with it is it's just oversubscribed. People, are just trying to use too much of the water, and there's not enough of it. And, that's for those of us that are Easterners. I guess I have to consider myself that these days, even though I grew up in the West. But most Easterners don't realize how darn dry the West is. I mean, the whole West is arid. It's very dry. And so, there's some interesting things about the Colorado. For example, when you're going down the Colorado River, you have to carry all your feces out in ammo cans. And when you urinate, you go into the water to do it, because of the number of people that are going down the Colorado. To be peeing on the banks would upset the delicate ecosystem out there. But,
wow.
It was quite the trip, let me tell you. And trip of a lifetime. Yeah.
Well, geez, that's Alan, did you ever carry your own feces out of the Kennebec River while you guys were rafting up there?
That's required by law. You can't get a permit. You can't get a license to be an outfitter unless you're going to do that. And that's inspected. The Forestry Service has specific areas on the Kennebec and Penobscot where you're allowed to eat, and they actually inspect for those sorts of things. Oh yeah, it's a job that we always assign to the youngest guide, and it's one that no one really wants to talk about. But if you think about it, raft in any given raft trip on the Kennebec and Penobscot, any given raft trip is going to have 80 people in it if the company's full up. Usually on a Saturday, Sunday, is going to be 1,000 people, and they will be stopping at I'm going to say maybe 4 possible different sites. So that's an average 250 people per site. You've got to have a plan to make sure and keep that place clean and well picked up and managed, or you're going to have a mess, a literal mess on your hands to clean it up. And so it's in everybody's interest to try and do that. Early on, nobody ever cared about that sort of thing. But right in 1982, they made a lot of laws in the state of Maine that regulated rafting. That was one of them.
Well, not directly Clean Water Act related, but certainly, certainly a worthy law to have, and I'm glad that I've rafted all the rivers in Maine, and yeah, those areas are well kept and well maintained, and I think the rafting companies do a fantastic job because they understand the resource that they're using, right? So, so that actually leads me. So toilet paper, are you guys over or under kind of people with the rolls? Mac, how do you
Oh,
prefer?
again, I'm going to go back to my mom. She would kill me if I didn't say over is the only way to go.
Yeah, that's
She was
interesting.
very, very strident about that.
Okay. What about you, Nick?
Never even thought about it.
So, however you found it.
You just
Sounds
put the toilet paper on the,
Nick,
whatever
it
you
sounds
call
to me
that.
like you
On
don't
the
do a
spindle,
lot
and
of.
that's it.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you don't change the rollout. Are you that guy that always uses the last square and then manages to
no,
leave it?
I'm always the guy who changes the rollout. I just don't care.
All right, fair enough. And Alan, you're an over or under kind of guy.
I was afraid you were going to ask me this. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. What's an over and under guy? Explain this to me.
Well, Alan, you know what toilet paper is, right?
Sure.
When you put
Carbon
the
moss,
roll,
I should say.
when you put the roll on the spindle, do you want the
Oh,
paper
yeah,
to
I
come
know.
over the top or under
Yeah.
the back?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I
I
made
will
some
tell you. What were you gonna say? You an over or under guy?
toilet paper dispensers one time because I thought I could sell a bunch of them, I arranged it exactly so it was an over the top. But I'm not sure that was the way to have done it. I never sold them, to tell you the truth.
Well, that's good to know. So there's well, say like I said, you never know where the conversation's gonna take us. So, but anyway, so let's jump into that a little bit. I want to talk about what Maine's rivers were like before the Clean Water Act. So back in the 70s, and I think Alan, you mentioned that you rafted in 76 just as the last log drives were happening. So were you guys actually dodging logs on that trip, or what was the river like at that time?
76 was the last year that they could put new wood in, or rather 75 was the last year they could cut new wood for the river, but they gave them the laws, state of Maine gave the paper companies until 1976 to get their inventory down the river. And so when we started rafting, we were still rafting with these giant, with the rivers being filled with pulp. Now, it really wasn't any problem to raft with pulp. You and the pulp logs are all traveling about the same speed. Occasionally you'd get a piece of pulp into the raft or something, but I don't think anybody ever got hurt. And it really wasn't a big concern. But what was a huge concern were the sluiceways. One in particular, just below Harris Station on the Kennebec River. There's this giant metal steel chute that came halfway down the gorge wall with a zip on the end, like that swoosh that Nike uses. And they dump the pulp in at the top. It would come almost in free fall down this highly polished steel chute, hit that loop at the bottom, go flying way up into the air, and then drop into the middle of the river. Well, at the time, we used to contact Scott Paper Company to tell them to hold up the logs because we were running a raft trip that day. But, I knew a lot of those guys, and I worked in the woods with them myself. And, a lot of those guys were half drunk or stoned most of the day. You never wanted to trust that sort of thing. And so that was always the thing that worried us. We'd get a few thousand pounds of logs dumped on our head. Every now and again, too, they would close off the Kennebec right where it enters Indian Pond. And they'd put a log boom, what they called a slack out there, and it would catch all the pulp coming down the river. And if you happen to come rafting on a day when they had that catch boom filled up, you had to pull the boat out of water and drag it along this really moist, wet shoreline that stank, that had all sorts of stuff coming up out of it. Yeah, and all sorts of junk coming up. That's the Harris Station where we would put in for the lower end of the gorge run. And to get around that boom, you'd have to drag your raft. That really wasn't very pleasant. That was the issues that logging had for us. They're still there today. I mean, as Howard Trotsky's study back in the 70s showed, that a lot of that pulp bark turned to a gelatinous mass, which you can still find in the backwaters of the Kennebec today. That was our pollution too. I mean, the Kennebec, the days that I worked on it, the issue wasn't the water quality per se, but the fact that the water was filled with bark and dirt and pulp logs coming down the river.
Jeez. Yeah.
A lot of sediment oxygen demand was using up a lot of the oxygen in the water at that time.
There was a real
the bark
with oxygen
and dirt and so forth that had fallen off of the logs was then being degraded by the bacteria and chewing up the oxygen.
that had the fishing in the Kennebec from the Forks down got so bad that the state of Maine in 72, I think, in 71, hired the University of Maine to do a study on it. Howard Trotsky was the guy that did that study. Those were the conclusions they found. And you can even say, in California rivers found the same problems. They had gotten out of pulp logging on using the rivers before Maine really had. But nobody in Maine could trust it because it was an out-of-stater thing. It was from California, and who knew what those people were thinking, who they were. So Maine had to have its own study to try and figure that out.
Well,
as somebody born in California, just let me say you can't trust them people.
Yeah, we still don't trust them. So,
well, there's an inherent problem with Maine. Maine people don't trust anybody from out of state. I mean, look at this last thing with the power corridor. The worst thing that could be said of it, who is going to benefit? Massachusetts people. I mean, right from the very beginning, we've had these issues with anybody outside the state of Maine.
Well, we could probably do a whole show on the corridor too, and I think Nick could lead us on that one. So, but hey, so some of the first things that were problems from the river, we talked yesterday, Nick, Mac, and I about the standards. Mac, can you kind of elaborate on some of that? They were looking at odor.
Sure. Well, let me just mention that, back in, before the Clean Water Act was passed, the Androscoggin River was rated one of the 10 most polluted waterways in the country. And you can go back, and if you go to a library that has old National Geographics, look up the 1960, I don't remember which month, but they had an article called Of Slime and River, which was about the Androscoggin River. And really the big villain there was the pulp and paper mills up and along the river, as well as the municipal discharges and, many other things. But the water in the Androscoggin got to be so bad that the stories are that in Lewiston, in Little Canada, on a bad day, the fumes coming off the river would turn all the paint on the houses black and cause it to start peeling. The sulfide fumes from the pulp mills. So Maine has certainly seen its share of bad rivers in the past. And the Clean Water Act was amazing because it came out and really, in my research, it was the first time that we really concentrated on water quality and not navigability of rivers.
Yeah. So, and maybe Nick can comment on this one, but was the river able to sustain any aquatic life at that time, or how, we've talked a little yesterday, and we'll discuss at the end about how the fisheries have been, coming back, but what was the fisheries like back then? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there were times when probably all of Maine's major rivers had dissolved oxygen levels of 0. And so, the rivers went completely anoxic and probably killed all the fish that were in those zones. Fish have a way of recolonizing places, but in the heat of a summer with low flows and heavy discharges, Maine's rivers would go anoxic and die essentially.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that. I think there were stretches on every major Maine river that had sections that went to 0 dissolved oxygen. And I don't know about any of you guys, but if you had zero dissolved or zero oxygen available, I don't think you'd last all that long either.
Well, they say 3 minutes. That right? That's the rule of threes. So, all right. Well, geez, this is, as is usual, the time is flying by. So I am gonna take another quick sponsor break and just make sure I thank them, because as I said before, without our sponsors, this is definitely a tough go where when my mouse stopped working. I'm gonna have to get a backup for the next one, but thank goodness for touchscreens. So, but anyway, thanks again to our sponsor, Pierce Atwood. They're highly regarded full service law firm with offices in Portland and Augusta, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Providence, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. Pierce Atwood provides legal and business counsel to its clients, which range from regional and local enterprises, utilities, financiers, middle market companies, and entrepreneurs, to Fortune 500 companies, multinational corporations, and even state and foreign governments. So their lawyers provide clients with a full suite of services covering energy, environmental, employment, real estate, corporate, and intellectual property issues. And I can speak from personal experience. I've worked with Pierce Atwood for many years. My first contact with Brian Rayback back probably 12 years ago about an agreement with a neighboring utility, to working with Sarah Tracy on solar power net energy billing agreement, and even more recently working with Dan Strader on personnel policies. So whatever it is that I've needed help on, they find a way, or they have an expert that can help you out. So I've always found great value in the services they provide. They're not the cheapest law firm, but they are the best, and they provide the best value. So I'm completely satisfied with the service that they have provided me in the Brunswick Sewer District, and I look forward to continuing our relationship. I really can't say enough about how their attorneys and their staff are. And so thanks again for supporting this program. And I know that their clients derive superior value based on the firm's efficient, cost-effective service structure, coupled with its high levels of sophistication, responsiveness, and industry expertise. So with that, we'll return to the content of the show. And as I figured, in many cases, I have an outline that we kind of work with here, and then the show goes like this and like that. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the driving forces behind the Clean Water Act, and it was Senator Edmund Muskie, and I think it was we know it's 1972. But Nick, can you help me elaborate on that some? Like, what was the real push, and why did it happen at that time? And then we talked about how it went from navigation based to water quality based. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Maine's experience was duplicated across the country, and probably the most famous example of just what a mess our rivers were is the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And it had enough.
I don't mean to interrupt, Nick, but that was one of those just banner things that really helped move it along.
Yeah. And those types of issues really bubbled up, as it were. And there was support at many different levels for doing something about our rivers. And that sort of became inexorable, I think. And that, was a big piece of the start of, that period of the environmentalist movement in the US was focused on clean water.
So it's interesting because, I've heard about that, and I've heard, it's all conjecture, but I've heard there may have even been incidences of fire on the Androscoggin River. But one of our listeners online, Darren, says he used to make his parents roll up the windows when they drove over the Green Bridge between Lewiston and Auburn, so because it smelled so bad. So,
the Bernard Lown Peace Bridge.
Oh yeah, there you go. So I knew Mac would be an expert in that area. So after what was it, 32 years at Lopka? So
Just a whisker under 30.
okay, so there's not much that went into the river that Mac didn't know about, I suppose, over the last 30 years. So and let's talk a little bit about how the Clean Water Act, and Mac, this probably is more your expertise, but you know, and Alan and Nick, always, I want anybody to feel free to chime in if you have something to add. But you know, so how does the Clean Water Act work? What it just set a
Well, you
rule?
know, yeah. Again, the Clean Water Act was landmark legislation. First of all, you know, it was signed by Richard Nixon. I mean, a lot of us forget that, you know, I mean, and let's face it, Richard Nixon was no tree-hugging liberal peacenik kind of thing, you know. I mean, he was a very conservative guy, but there was a groundswell of public opinion, and you know, along with the Clean Water Act really came the, you know, it's not the same legislation, but that's when EPA was created as well, the Environmental Protection Agency. William Ruckelshaus was the first administrator there. So it was interesting, but even though the Clean Water Act called for the elimination of pollutant discharges, which, you know, is, if you think about that, it's an absolutely unachievable goal. Are we ever going to eliminate the discharge of wastewater to waterways? No. Are we going to get to where there is absolutely zero pollutant in there? No, I don't think that's possible, especially with analytical methods that keep on seeing lower and lower concentrations of things. But the real genius, in my opinion, about the Clean Water Act was it set this lofty goal and then kind of stepped back from that and said as well that all rivers in the United States needed to be, quote unquote, fishable, swimmable. Well, that's a little bit different than, you know, saying that, you know, there needs to be nothing but H2O in the water. And the other thing that it did was it set technology-based standards, and said, okay, well, what is, you know, we had a lot of capability at that time, but it really wasn't being very widely used. And so secondary treatment became the standard, biological treatment. And the limits were sort of, it set a floor of 30 milligrams per liter BOD and TSS on a monthly average basis. And so that was applied around the country, and everybody's on the same footing, so that you didn't have, you know, one of the issues at the time was, well, if Massachusetts sets this standard and Oklahoma sets that standard and somebody else, well, industry will go where the standards are the weakest. So there was a lot of genius to the Clean Water Act, but not the least of which was that Congress came up with a bunch of funding to do it. In the case of Lewiston Auburn, for example, really creating LOPCA was one of the first times those two cities ever worked together. Historically, they were always at loggerheads. You know, all the bosses lived in Auburn and the workers lived in Lewiston, and they were always fighting back and forth. And it was because the Clean Water Act basically set up incentives that if they built one treatment plant, they would get 95% funding instead of 75% funding to build the thing. And from that time on, really that cooperation led to all kinds of cooperation with the two cities. So,
yeah, I mean, to the point where I know that it didn't happen, but wasn't there something on the ballot about trying to merge the two cities not that long ago, or was there something?
There was a few years ago, but seriously, I mean, you look back and LOPCA, Lewiston Auburn Water Pollution Control Authority, although it was created before the Clean Water Act, that was really the impetus for those two communities becoming, you know, the partners they are today.
Oh, that's interesting. See, I didn't know that either. So it definitely shows how far they've come, and you make a good point how the Clean Water Act has kind of brought us all together, because we all want to use the rivers in some form or another, whether it's getting power from the river or recreating on the river. You know, they're one of our greatest resources, and not just rivers, all water bodies.
Perhaps my biggest disappointment with the whole thing is how often our rivers are not appreciated as the beautiful resources they are. The Androscoggin River is a beautiful river now. It's
Yeah.
it's a tremendous bass fishery right there in Lewiston, Auburn. There's a bass fishing tournament held annually. It's supposed to be one of the best bass fisheries in the country. And yet still, this summer I did a little canoe trip down the river on a Saturday, and from Lewiston down to Durham, didn't see another soul on the river. Absolutely beautiful. You get on that river and you would think you were in the middle of Piscataquis County or something, or out where there aren't people. It's just any day on the river is a wonderful day.
Yeah, I agree with you. You're getting down into my territory as you get down to Durham. So beautiful. I've been out and done some fishing on myself out there, and it's great. So, well, let's talk a little bit about that, because Nick, I know that you're a pretty avid fisherman, and what do you use the river for? I mean, obviously NRCM, you guys work very, very hard to protect the rivers in all kinds of different ways. But what do you use the river for, and what's your favorite things to do?
So I live in Hollowell. So I live near the Kennebec, and that's the river I use most often. I have to say that since I came to Maine, I've found myself doing less fishing than I would have thought. And part of the reason for that is that there's this thing called catch and release that everybody does here. And I just can't relate. I just don't want to bug the fish. Either I got to eat the fish, or I just don't really feel like, I don't really feel like fishing. So I do some shad fishing, and you're allowed to keep a couple of shad a day, and shad is one of my favorite fish to eat. Smoked shad is really good, and shad roe is an incredible delicacy. I have to say that I feel responsible. I feel like I would feel guilty if I didn't say that people should be careful about that, because unfortunately, even the shad have high levels of things like PCBs in them. And even though they spend much of their lives in saltwater, these are fish that are not recommended for heavy consumption, and they're not recommended for women, children, or pregnant women who may become pregnant, or children. But for somebody like me, I love to eat shad. I love to catch shad. I can go out and catch shad and release a bunch of them, but take a couple home and feel like I'm doing my thing. But what I've mostly become into for using the river is just watching fish, watching the sea run fish come back and the sea run fish leave, and then duck hunting. And I think my favorite river story of the Kennebec, and the Kennebec below Waterville has just changed so dramatically since I came here, because of the removal of the Edwards and the Fort Halifax dams. And I was very involved in the fight over the Fort Halifax dam, and in getting that dam out, something that the dam owner wanted to do, by the way. That should not have been a horrible, long process, but it was. It was a big fight, but it was totally worth it. We've gone from having a very small alewife run on the Kennebec that used to get pumped over the Edwards Dam in just a few years after Fort Halifax came out, to having the largest alewife run in North America. And it is just a spectacular thing to watch those fish come back. If you haven't been to Benton Falls in May, go. Just the power of the ocean and the power of the rivers and the connections between the two of them, nothing illustrates that better than watching the alewives come back. We also have the largest concentrations of bald eagles in the country, in this part of the country, east of the Mississippi, during those alewife runs. But my favorite story about this is I was out with a friend of mine and his daughter in my duck boat one year. I think this must have been about 2010. So maybe it's 2012, sort of a few years after Fort Halifax came out. And we were out in September and we were scouting for ducks. And again, I think the reason I got into duck hunting is because you eat all your ducks. Anyway, I was driving back. We were heading back in. The sun was just going down. And I hit the throttle on the boat, just stopped the boat because something caught my eye. And I just had to stop the boat quickly. And my friend and his daughter went shooting forward in the boat and up against the bow. And they looked at me like I was nuts. And they were like, "What the hell did you do that for?" I said, "Just look." And in every direction, as far as you could see, the river was running silver. It was silver with all the juvenile alewives and all the juvenile shad that were coming down the river, out of the lakes, out of their spawning areas upriver or their rearing areas upriver. And literally as far upriver, as far downriver, and from bank to bank, it was full of these juvenile fish. You could just stick your hand in it and see these little fish swimming around your hand. And it was incredible and just made me feel like, all that work and all the fighting over getting those dams out was really worth it. And it also made me feel like we've got a long way to go, because for sea-run fish, we're somewhere around 5 to 10% of our historic numbers. And the big cause of our sea-run fish problems is dams. We have over 1,000 dams in Maine. About 100 of them generate power, maybe 120. We have 9 dams that deliver more than half of our hydropower capacity. And almost all of them are way up in the river, like Harris and Wyman, where they're not hurting sea-run fish. But because of our history with small industrial facilities along every river that used to use water power, we have these tiny little dams in Maine that got converted to hydroelectric power that gets subsidized by, sorry about this, states like Massachusetts that want to say they're using green power, and they block fish for generating a half a megawatt or a megawatt of power. And we have to do some thinking in this state about whether or not that's a worthwhile exchange, because our rivers are not as alive as they should be, in spite of all the progress that we've made because of the Clean Water Act. And most people don't, as Max said, you don't usually run into people very often when you're out on our rivers, particularly not in September in the evening. And people don't get many opportunities to see these incredible migrations. But they really are some of the world's great migrations. They're like comparable to things like wildebeest migrations in Africa, which you do see because people fly over them, or migrations of the buffalo. These are those kind of incredible primal movements of animals that, that fed this country for many decades in the 1700s and 1800s. And they could again.
Well, Nick, that I tried to do a screen share there, and I don't know if it showed the picture, but it was a picture of a bald eagle that I had taken this summer. It's interesting you mentioned the alewife run, because we have a family camp on Long Pond in Windsor, which is part of the Sheepscot River, and they took out a dam in Cooper's Mills a few years ago, and we were a little nervous when the dam was going to come out, like, what's that going to do to the water level? It's already a shallow pond and so forth. But really, it didn't do anything, and they had studies that had showed that it wasn't going to affect the pond level. So then, I think everybody was fine with it. But what's interesting is in the last 3 years that the alewives, they come in June and they just bubble out of the water all night long, and I can stand out on the dock and watch them, and it's really amazing. And then the pond went from having maybe one eagle, 15, 20 years ago, to countless. I mean, there's eagles flying around all day long. They look like chickadees up there. There's probably 20, 30 of them. And then same thing with the loon population. It has just boomed. You know, we at one point, and we were pretty sure we were down to 3 total loons on the pond. And I don't know how many there are now because they're everywhere. I mean, they're out on my dock every morning. And so it really is amazing what's happened. And, you know, it's great, the progress that we've all made, you know, regardless of what side you're on or what your role is in this. You know, Mac and I have a different role than you have, and Alan had a different role as well. And but we're all reaching for the same goal, right? You know, so let's elaborate a little bit on that.
I'll just throw out a quick little story. Every winter at Lopka, there are 3 or 4 eagles that come around because they want to fish at where the warm discharge from the treatment plant opens up the river enough for them to be able to fish and so forth. So they come around the treatment plant every winter for a few months and hang out. It's kind of cool. But one of those sort of artificial things, I suppose. But
yeah, but it shows that you know, it's not all just a negative impact, right? And Nick touched on it a little bit as well. The Harris and Wyman's dams up on the Kennebec River that generate the majority of the power that the state uses. Of all the, would you say 20 dams, I think, that generate power, those 2 are probably the biggest. But you know, they're not affecting sea run fish up there, but they are pretty important to the river industry. So, you know, Alan, maybe you can touch on this, because according to American Rivers, fishing is a $45 billion industry. I can't remember the numbers on rafting and tourism industry in Maine, but I think it's close to $1 billion. You know, what's your thought? Are the dams highly regarded up there? Is it a valuable resource? And tell me a little bit about how its effect on the rafting
They
industry.
see it as a valuable resource and have for a long time. But of course, they've got a completely different take on the dams. I mean, for them, the dam is providing them with an income. I mean, whitewater rafting brings an awful lot of people into that area. And of course, they are power producers as well. You saw that too in this last debate over the corridor. I mean, the very first people to jump on the issue of stopping the corridor and supporting dam production of electricity were the people involved in rafting themselves that are there on it. I think in a certain sense, that's kind of a flaw in the whole idea of who's protecting the river. I mean, in the end, most of the whitewater rafting companies, I would say that I know just about every outfitter up there, and they all are very positive. They all want the river to be healthy, and they all want the river to be clean and flowing. But in the end, the whitewater rafting depends upon getting people down that river. And that's what their ultimate interest is going to be. I'm not sure who's going to stand up actually for the rivers in the future. I'm not sure who can, but those dams ultimately, I think they eventually will become an issue of whether they ought to be there. Both of them are approaching their, both of them are going to be approaching their lifespans over the next 20, 30 years. I mean, Harris was built in 1950, and so that may be a little bit longer, but there are going to be questions about them. I'd never thought about that angle of the sea run fish not coming that far north. I guess I'd never thought about it in quite that way. There's really no way for fish to move through Harris Station at all. I mean, that's really kind of a block in the river. That I think is wrong. I mean, I'm sure there's no sea run fish there, but nevertheless, there's got to be something wrong with that. It always seemed to me, anyways.
Well, I think you know, we need hydropower. There isn't any question about it. But we also need a fishing industry. And one of the reasons that you know, the ground fishing industry was so prominent and profitable and thrived in Maine is because ground fish would come closer to shore chasing these sea run fish. And that meant, particularly for halibut, you could get a lot of them. And once those sea-run fish runs disappeared, those groundfish, cod, halibut, they stayed a lot farther offshore, and it takes a lot more work to get them. Now, there's a little other problem called overfishing that we did with those fish species too, but we can't expect the Gulf of Maine to function the way it should function when we're taking out 90% of this huge influx of or huge flow of nutrients and energy back and forth between our rivers, lakes, and oceans. And those connections used to exist. We've sort of divided up in the world up into rivers, lakes, and the ocean, saltwater and freshwater. But that's a human construct, not a fish construct. And so you have to, we didn't think about the balance between what we get from hydropower and what we get from having viable migratory fisheries. And, it is fundamentally a food versus energy balance. But at the time that we put in industrial facilities on every small stream and every small river all over the place, we built the dams to power those facilities, mostly with hydromechanical power. And then for a lot of those, we just converted them to hydroelectric power. And those dams have been there forever. So people forgot, how important these sea-run fisheries once were to all of us. They used to get us through the winter. And, people would smoke this stuff and salt this stuff, and it would be food. So I think there are conversations that we need to have about what the right balance is between hydropower and our sea-run fisheries. And a couple of metrics that I just use to think about this is, does it produce a lot of energy, and how much damage does it do to the sea-run fisheries? There's this idea out there, I think, that small hydropower is better than big hydropower. And that's not necessarily true at all. Edwards was a much bigger problem than Harris and Wyman are, even though it produced a tiny fraction of the electricity. Either Harris or Wyman produces more electricity than all the rest of the dams below them on the Kennebec. So those two dams are really important in terms of hydroelectric production. They're not destroying our sea-run fisheries. That's a way that you can think about dams that we don't often do.
Well, if I can, I'm just going to jump in here and say I think that you're hitting the nail on the head in a lot of ways, but it's broader than that. I mean, everything is a trade-off. I mean, almost anything we as humans do seems like it bothers some part of the environment. But there are trade-offs there. So we need to look at those. One point I guess I want to make is if you research it, the effort that we have put into clean water, and particularly delivering drinkable water to people, has done more for human health than all the medical dollars that have been put into hospitals, doctors, nurses, and everything else throughout the years. So it's really a good value, and that's what we should look at. And going forward, I guess where I'm going with all this is that we need to look at, where's the bang for the buck? Where can we make the biggest impacts? And going forward, where that's going to be is going to be non-point source pollution. And we need to be looking a lot at that. And so that's really where I think from the days of the Clean Water Act, where things are morphing now.
So, geez, Mac, it's like you read the script or something. You took us right into where we go from here. So we are up to 1 hour. So I am going to just thank my sponsor one last time, and then I'll come back around and just get final thoughts from everyone, and we'll try to wrap this up. But again, Pierce Atwood, as I said at the beginning of the show, no one on this show gets paid. I don't get paid. But we need to raise some funds to offset those, to be able to offer the credits for free, that for the people that are listening and trying to get those professional development hours. So without sponsors, we wouldn't have the show. So I appreciate Pierce Atwood for stepping up. You know, they provide legal and business counsel to their clients, which again range from regional, local enterprises, utilities, financiers, Fortune 500 companies, multinational corporations, state, foreign governments. And, you know, I'm a client myself at the Brunswick Sewer District. Their lawyers, they have a full suite of services covering energy, environmental, employment, real estate, corporate, intellectual property issues, contract negotiations, negotiations between utilities, personnel policies. You know, they're a very good resource that I turn to on a regular basis. So again, I want to thank Pierce Atwood for supporting this episode, and I know that their clients, you know, they get superior value based on the firm's efficient and cost-effective service structure. And so thank you again to them.
And I worked with them many years, and I agree. Good outfit.
I agree. And I think, you know, I think it depends which side of the aisle you're on, right, when you're dealing with them. But you know, from our standpoint, they've served us quite well. So yeah. So why don't we go around, and I'd like to ask for one. Honestly, we covered most of what I wanted to get to today, but you know, what do you think, Alan? Did you enjoy coming on the show? Do you have any final thoughts? And would you be willing to do it again if we had a follow-up?
Oh, sure. I like, you know, I working on the Kennebec River for 12 years, I guess, in my youth is really defined my entire life. I mean, how I look at things and how I feel about things was determined by that time period, by that clean water, by that river flowing. I made my living back then on those dams. Whitewater rafting couldn't exist without dams. But nowadays, I'm not so sure that I like the idea of dams. I mean, I understand the idea of the trade-offs and all, but I don't know if that's the future direction for us to take with this. I mean, think about how old that technology is, really, when it gets right down to it. And think about what is left afterwards. I mean, when the dam's life expectancy has been reached, what do you do then with the dam? And what happens in the pond that's above the impoundment that's beyond that dam? I'm just not so sure anymore that damming anything up. I want to point out, I worked in Waterville on the days when that discussion over the dam in Winslow was being held. And there was a lot of bitter feeling about taking that dam out. But if you go back there today and talk to those same people, they'll tell you it was the best move they ever made. They'll tell you that it has improved our life here in Waterville, getting rid of that dam. I think that's true with a lot of structures that we build along the sides of the river.
Yeah, well, that's good insight, and you know, that shows a lot of growth, and shows how as we live our lives, you know, our views can change. So thanks again for coming on, and I appreciate the stories too, and maybe we can get some more of those stories out of you in the near future. So yeah. So, and Nick, you have any closing remarks that you'd like to add?
Well, I would just say that, you know, I agree with Mac that the Clean Water Act was one of the most profound pieces of legislation that's happened in my lifetime. And it's certainly done a lot to shape how I've ended up living my life. And, you know, my experiences out on the ocean and out on Maine's rivers have really, you know, been some of the highlights of my time, both in work and out of work. And, you know, I'm grateful for how good things are and how much better they are. And I also feel like there are things that still need to change and that we can do better still. And there's a lot of work ahead of us to try to keep our rivers and our clean water clean, and to bring back some of the incredible resources that we used to have and should have again.
Well said. And so, just for the record, I have it right down here. Nick agrees with Mac.
That wouldn't be a first.
So,
That's happened before.
All right, good to know. So, and Mac, what about you? Do you have any closing thoughts you want to
Well-
share with the listeners?
Sure, I have to start off by saying, Alan, watch out by dissing things that are old. I resemble that damn remark. But truly, I guess I want to remind everybody that, we humans, we have an impact. And, if we're looking at the problems, particularly environmental problems, the place to start looking is in the mirror. If you don't like PFAS, well then, gee, what about those water repellent clothing you've got? So we have further places to go. We can make more improvements, and let's look at what's practical and what works and what makes sense. And that's the legacy to me of the Clean Water Act. We rolled up our sleeves and said, how can we get in there and make it work? What technology do we have that we can apply to this problem? Not let's make it perfect. Let's start off by making it better. And incremental change is where you're really going to make improvement, because you can't do everything that you want to do tomorrow.
Right. Well, and I would say, and that's a great way to wrap it up, Mac. I mean, we've come a long ways in 50 years, and I'm excited to see where we'll be 50 years from now, and the technologies, and of course, what's the emerging contaminants. We could do a whole show on that. So, but yeah, we've gone over. It's been a great conversation. So we'll wrap it up. Thank you all very much. And hopefully you enjoyed your time today. And like I said to everyone earlier, check it out. YouTube, Waters Up. If you do a search, you should be able to find us, no problem, or access us through the Maine Water Utilities website. And make sure you tell all your friends and family, and help us grow this show and make it wildly popular. And hopefully we can continue to do it. So thanks again. And I'll hopefully reach out again soon. And I truly do appreciate it.
Thanks to you for
Thanks,
doing this,
Rob.
Rob.
You're welcome. Take care. Happy
Happy
holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, all the above.
You too.
All right.